All right, so today's topic is the t-test, and we'll see that the t-test is actually three different tests, so we'll talk about each of those. Um, we talked about the z-test last time, and I think I hinted at it, said a few times, well, this is a foundation, this is kind of like a test that we just teach because it's a great introduction. It doesn't have all of these issues that we need to talk about. We need to discuss a few new things when we discuss the t-test. It gets a little bit more complicated, various different situations. So the z-test, a good starting point, but it does have some limitations, and I'll talk about what those are in a sec. So the limitations of the z-test. You have to know the population standard deviation. That's a huge limitation because we rarely know information about the population. The whole idea behind inferential statistics is we're trying to estimate what the population looks like because we don't know. Just to highlight that, you have to know the population standard deviation. You have to know the population standard deviation. That might seem like a minor thing, but this was something that was really quite vexing for statisticians for many years. What that would mean practically is that you really couldn't use statistics like the z-statistic unless you had a really big sample, and you could be pretty confident that whatever the sample standard deviation was, it would match the population standard deviation. That made it really difficult for researchers in some areas who couldn't get really big samples. This is so uncommon that R doesn't have anything built in for doing the z-test because it's not something that's practically useful. And again, as I mentioned, this would mean that researchers used to have to collect huge data sets, which pretty much defeats the entire purpose of sampling. So a new strategy was devised. This is William Seeley Gossett, who had to publish his work under the name student. So you'll sometimes hear this referred to as students t-test. The reason he worked on research involving the best yielding strains for barley. And this meant, this is seasonal. You could plant a few different strains, but you couldn't get thousands and thousands and thousands of samples. So that's what he was working on. He discovered a distribution that will allow us to estimate the mean of the population even when sample sizes are small. That kind of cracked the code on what to do about this population standard deviation problem. This involves a new series of distributions that are based on the normal distribution, but are a little bit more spread out to take into account the uncertainty that we have as samples are smaller. And that's where we got the t-test. The t-test essentially replaces the z-test when sample sizes are small, or practically, you'll never be using the z-test. You'll always be using t. Nearly every situation, because we hardly ever know sigma. And again, it's called student because Gossett's employer did not allow their employees to publish their work. So he published it as student. And what makes Gossett one of my favorite statisticians is that his employer was actually the Guinness Brewing Company. Not that I like Guinness very much, but I certainly do like beer. Makes me wonder why I'm not drinking a beer while I do these lectures. I am at home. Anyway, we'll try that out one day, see if they get more entertaining. We're going to see three different t-tests along the way, and they're for different situations. The one sample t-test is the one that's going to look the most like what we just saw with the z-test, comparing a sample mean against a hypothesized mean. The independent samples t-test is for comparing means that are drawn from two separate groups. These are two groups that have different people, which is why we say the groups are independent, and none of the same people in each group. And finally, there's the paired sample t-test, sometimes called the correlated means t-test, comparing two groups that include the same people. Most commonly, this is like a pre-post design. Sometimes you see designs like this with romantic partners, things that are naturally paired. But pre-post is I think 99% of the uses here. Each of these are going to have different formulas, so it's important to understand what situation we're in and which t-test we're using. Just to give you a sense of what the t-distribution looks like, the t-distribution is based on something called degrees of freedom. And practically degrees of freedom is almost exactly the same as sample size. We'll see that there's a formula, it's just subtracting sample size by a number. So what we'll see is that this distribution gets flatter and more spread out as the sample sizes are smaller. As sample sizes go up, this distribution eventually takes a shape just like the normal distribution. So it allows us to make these estimates more correctly under all situations. All right, next up, we'll talk about the one sample t-test.